On a humid July morning in 1983, a small newspaper in New Delhi printed a story that seemed too grotesque to ignore. The United States, it claimed, had created AIDS as a weapon at a military laboratory, and the virus had escaped into the world. The article read like an accusation hurled from the shadows, and it was. Behind it sat a quiet branch of the KGB that measured victory not in captured spies, but in altered beliefs. When people hear mind control, they picture hypnosis, drugs, or science fiction machines, sinister men in lab coats bending the will of strangers. The KGB's real ambition was both less fantastical and, in some ways, more frightening. It aimed to control not an individual mind with a switch, but the climate of opinion in a society, to make Americans doubt their institutions, fear their allies, hate their neighbors, and see the world through lenses carefully smeared with suspicion. The technique was not sorcery. It was patience, psychology, and an intimate understanding of how a free press can be turned into a delivery system. To understand how the KGB tried to do it, you have to picture two places at once. One is Moscow, the Lubyanka building yellow walls, heavy doors, corridors that seemed to absorb sound where the Soviet secret police had been headquartered since the early years after the Bolshevik Revolution. The other is New York City, in the canyons of Manhattan, where the Soviet Union maintained a diplomatic presence at the United Nations that doubled as one of the most important intelligence platforms on Earth. In between those two cities ran the Cold War's strangest supply chain: forged documents, planted stories, friendly peace committees, covert subsidies, compromised journalists, manipulated activists, and what Soviet intelligence called iktovny meropryatия, active measures, were not simply propaganda in the ordinary sense. Propaganda is loud and official. It wears a uniform. Active measures were meant to be deniable, indirect, and disguised as the work of someone else. A KGB officer could place a rumor in a foreign newspaper and let it drift across borders until it was repeated by people who believed they had discovered it on their own. Or he could manufacture a document, leak it through a plausible intermediary, and watch journalists chase it because it looked like evidence. The power was not in one lie, but in the way lies echoed, multiplied, and fused into the background noise of political life. The KGB inherited this mindset from earlier Soviet organs, the Cheka, the OGPU, the NKVD, and from the Communist International's long experience shaping parties and movements abroad. Long before the KGB formally appeared in 1954, Moscow had pursued influence in the United States through the Communist Party USA and through Soviet intelligence penetrations that later became famous, some for what they accomplished, others for what they revealed when they were discovered. In the 1930s and 1940s, the NKVD recruited Americans who believed they were helping a progressive future, and in some cases Americans who simply wanted money, excitement, or leverage. The names that survived into public consciousness, Alger Hiss, Whittaker Chambers, Julius, and Ethel Rosenberg, are often reduced to courtroom drama, but behind the drama lay a strategic truth. Moscow had learned that the United States could be infiltrated not only physically, but ideologically. And then, in the late 1940s, the United States began to learn it too. One of the most consequential revelations came not from a dramatic arrest, but from paper cables. The Veneno Project, a US effort begun in 1943 to decrypt Soviet communications, slowly opened a window into Soviet espionage networks. Veneno's revelations, many of which became public decades later, did not merely show that Soviet intelligence stole secrets, they showed that it had cultivated sources embedded in the machinery of American government and industry. That knowledge shaped the American security state, fueling loyalty investigations and deepening a paranoia that would become its own kind of vulnerability. The Soviet services watched all of this with clinical interest. If they could not always place an agent in the right room, they could at least shape the mood outside the room, make Americans fear each other, question each other, and tear at their own institutions. Social distrust is not a side effect of influence operations. It is often the point. By the time the KGB was established in March 1954 as the Committee for State Security, it was an organization with a vast mandate. It handled foreign intelligence, internal security, border troops, communications interception, and political policing. Its foreign arm, the First Chief Directorate, ran intelligence operations abroad. But within that structure, active measures became a specialized craft. In later accounts from defectors and from archives that emerged after the Soviet collapse, including material associated with KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, who defected to the United Kingdom in 1992, active measures appear not as an occasional trick, but as a sustained policy line. A critical turning point came when Yuri Andropov became KGB chairman in May 1967. Andropov was not a caricature of a spy master. He was an ideological bureaucrat with a strategic imagination, a man who believed the Soviet Union was in a global political struggle that would be decided as much by perception as by missiles. Under Andropov, active measures expanded in ambition. The KGB Service A, often identified as the unit responsible for disinformation and influence, was tasked with operations designed to weaken NATO cohesion, inflame racial tensions in the United States, discredit American leaders, and amplify anti-war and anti-nuclear currents that aligned with Soviet interests. None of this required Americans to be hypnotized. The KGB's method was to find existing fractures and pry them open. A free society has arguments in public. It advertises its internal wounds. The KGB studied those wounds like an engineer studies stress lines in a bridge. The Vietnam War was an early and obvious opportunity. The war created real, organic protest movements driven by grief, outrage, moral conviction, and political opposition. Moscow did not create American anti-war sentiment, Americans did, in response to American decisions and casualties. But Soviet intelligence and Allied services in the Eastern Bloc had every incentive to encourage, finance, and steer certain narratives when they could. The goal was not necessarily to control the protest movement like a puppet, but to push it toward conclusions useful to the Soviet Union, that the US was uniquely criminal, that American democracy was a sham, that NATO allies should distance themselves, that the US military was an occupying force rather than a Cold War actor, and that resistance to American policy was not merely political but existential. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union and its allies invested in a landscape of front organizations groups that presented themselves as independent civic bodies, but were aligned with Soviet policy aims. Some were explicitly connected to the international communist movement. Others were broader peace organizations that attracted a spectrum of participants, including sincere activists with no interest in Soviet control. This distinction mattered, and the KGB exploited it. If a front group could attract genuine believers, their authenticity became camouflage. The World Peace Council, for example, founded in 1950 and long associated with Soviet-aligned peace campaigning, became part of the ecosystem in which narratives hostile to NATO nuclear policy could flourish. The point was not that every peace activist was a dupe. The point was that the KGB understood something timeless. You don't need to manufacture a crowd if you can blend into one. At the same time, the KGB did not abandon the older methods. It ran agents, recruited sources, and conducted influence through individuals who could shape opinion from inside institutions. Some of this activity became visible through defections and counterintelligence cases. When Oleg Kalugin, a KGB officer who served in the United States in the late 1950s and early 1960s and late 1950s, and later became a general, spoke after the Cold War, he described active measures as a major part of Soviet foreign intelligence work operations intended to weaken the West, to drive a wedge between allies, and to influence policy debates. Defectors often have motives and biases, but their accounts align with what later archival and governmental reports described. Active measures were not folklore, they were an institutional priority. One reason active measures worked at all is that America's information system rewards novelty and scandal. A well-placed forged document or leaked confidential memo can do more damage than 1,000 official Soviet press releases, and here the Eastern Bloc developed a particular craft, the political forgery. The Czechoslovak intelligence service, the SINPI, became notorious for disinformation work, and one of its former officers, Ladislav Bickman, defected in 1968 and later wrote about the techniques. He described a world of fabricated letters, fake government memos, and planted rumors designed to be picked up by legitimate media. Whether the operation began in Prague, East Berlin, or Moscow, the logic was the same. The lie must enter the target society through a channel the society trusts, or at least through a channel it cannot easily dismiss as foreign. The United States government took this seriously enough that in the 1980s, the U.S. State Department began publicly cataloging Soviet active measures. In 1986 and 1987, it issued reports describing forgeries and disinformation efforts, including those aimed at U.S. allies and at American domestic audiences. These reports did not claim that Soviet disinformation controlled America like a remote control. They claimed something subtler and more plausible. The Soviet services repeatedly tried to inject falsehoods into the bloodstream of public discourse, hoping the body politic would circulate them. One of the most infamous examples, the one that begins in that New Delhi newspaper in 1983, was what Western analysts later called Operation INF Ekection, also known as the AIDS disinformation campaign. The claim that AIDS was a U.S. bioweapon linked to Fort Detrick, Maryland, did not appear out of nowhere. It was crafted to exploit genuine fear and ignorance about a terrifying new disease, and it played on existing suspicions about military research. The story's first known appearance was in an Indian newspaper, The Patriot, on July 17, 1983, in an article attributed to an anonymous, well-known scientist and anthropologist. From there, the claim was repeated and embellished through various outlets in different countries, including Soviet media. By the late 1980s, the narrative had circulated globally. What made this operation so effective was that it was not aimed only at Americans. It was aimed at the world's perception of America, particularly in the global South, where memories of colonialism and exploitation made accusations of Western medical cruelty feel plausible. But it also boomeranged back into American discourse, feeding distrust in government and amplifying conspiracy thinking. A lie that travels internationally can re-enter its target from the outside, wearing the credibility of foreign reporting. The U.S. State Department's active measures reports and later historical research associated the AIDS disinformation campaign with KGB Service A, though the ecosystem included other Soviet and Allied entities. In the language of influence operations, this was a masterpiece of asymmetry. The Soviet Union did not need to prove the claim. It only needed people to repeat it, argue about it, and allow it to contaminate trust. The KGB understood that in a democracy you can weaken a rival not only by persuading people of a specific policy, but by persuading them that truth itself is unattainable, that all institutions lie, that all explanations are propaganda, that nothing can be known with confidence. That is not mind control. It is mind corrosion. By the 1980s, active measures expanded into a kind of cold-blooded opportunism. Any American tragedy or tension could be used as fuel. Racial conflict was a recurring target. The Soviet Union, which publicly condemned American racism, did so not out of altruism, but because it was strategically useful. Soviet media highlighted segregation, lynchings, and violence against civil rights activists, presenting the United States as hypocritical, preaching freedom while practicing oppression. There was truth in the coverage. Racism was real and brutal, but the selection and framing were weaponized. The Soviet message was designed to erode America's moral authority abroad and deepen bitterness at home. At times, the weaponization crossed into direct provocation. US government reports in the 1980s described Soviet-linked forgeries designed to inflame racial tensions, including fake letters and communications that appeared to come from extremist groups. One notorious category involved documents purporting to be from the Ku Klux Klan or similar organizations, aimed at intimidating or angering targets and creating the impression of widespread, organized hatred. The logic was simple. If you can't create a riot, you can try to create the fear that makes riots more likely. And the KGB's imagination did not stop at race. It moved wherever the American psyche was tender: fear of nuclear war, distrust of the CIA after scandals, anger over Vietnam, anxiety about economic decline, outrage over corruption. Active measures often sought to amplify the most cynical interpretation of events. If the US government made a mistake, Soviet disinformation would present it as deliberate evil. If America debated policy, Soviet influence would seek to make compromise feel like betrayal. One of the most strategically important arenas was nuclear policy in Europe, where public opinion mattered to whether NATO could deploy weapons and maintain political unity. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union deployed SS-20 intermediate-range missiles, a move that alarmed NATO. In December 1979, NATO adopted the dual-track decision: pursue arms control negotiations while preparing to deploy US Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe if talks failed. This set off a wave of protests across Europe and debates in Allied democracies. Again, much of the anti-nuclear movement was genuine and independent, but Soviet intelligence had every reason to encourage protests that would block NATO deployments while ignoring Soviet deployments. The Kremlin wanted a Europe frightened of American missiles and resigned to Soviet ones. In these years, the KGB and Allied services pushed narratives portraying NATO deployments as reckless, American leaders as warmongers, and European governments as puppets. The Soviet Union presented itself as the party of peace, even while maintaining a massive nuclear arsenal. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife, but irony doesn't stop fear. Fear is fertile soil for influence. All of this took place against a backdrop of heightened Cold War tension. In the early 1980s, the atmosphere felt electrically charged. Ronald Reagan, inaugurated in January 1981, spoke of the Soviet Union with moral clarity and hostility that alarmed Moscow. The Soviet leadership, geriatric and suspicious, interpreted many American actions through a lens of paranoia. When Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative in March 1983, soon dubbed Star Wars, Soviet strategists feared it could undermine deterrence. In September 1983, the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 07 after it strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including US Congressman Larry McDonald. The world watched in horror. The Soviets insisted it was a security incident. Much of the world saw it as an atrocity. Then came one of the most dangerous misunderstandings of the Cold War: Able Archer 83. In November 1983, NATO conducted a command post exercise simulating nuclear release procedures. It was a routine training event in NATO's mind, but Soviet intelligence interpreted aspects of the exercise as potentially covering preparations for a real first strike. Soviet fears at that time were institutionalized in Operation Rayan, a KGB and GRU effort to detect signs of a surprise nuclear attack. The details of Soviet perceptions were reconstructed later through intelligence and historical research, including accounts from Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who secretly worked for British intelligence and defected in 1985. The West learned that Moscow's fear was not theatrical. It was real enough to be dangerous. In such a climate, active measures served a double purpose. They were meant to weaken the adversary, yes, but also to stabilize the Soviet worldview by explaining hostility as proof of capitalist aggression. When a state is built on the belief that enemies surround it, Evidence of enmity is comforting. Disinformation is not only a weapon against others, it can become a narcotic for the user. But if we're looking for the moment when the KGB's attempt to control American minds became most visible as a coherent strategy, where the threads of forgeries, planted stories, and emotional manipulation braided together, the AIDS disinformation campaign is a strong candidate for a climax, not because it single-handedly changed American policy, but because it demonstrated the KGB's ability to take a scientific and medical terror and turn it into a political toxin, pushing a narrative that could not easily be disproven in the public imagination. In the early years of the AIDS crisis, the disease was poorly understood by the general public, heavily stigmatized, and terrifying in its mortality. Public trust in government had already been damaged by Vietnam and Watergate. The KGB did not need to invent mistrust. It needed only to feed it. Imagine the information environment of the 1980s. No social media, no algorithmic feeds, but plenty of vulnerability. News traveled through wire services, newspapers, radio, and television. Rumors traveled by word of mouth and by pamphlets. Conspiracy theories circulated through niche publications. And in that environment, the KGB's skill was to create something that looked like journalism. The Patriot article in 1983 was not a Soviet press release. It was an independent story. Once a claim appears in print under a neutral masthead, it becomes a reference point. The next outlet can cite the first. The next one can cite the second. The lie accumulates footnotes. The Soviet press then amplified the narrative. In 1986, the Soviet newspaper Literaturnaya Gazeta published a piece endorsing the claim that AIDS originated in US military research. East German and other Eastern Bloc outlets also spread versions of the story. Western researchers and journalists later traced the campaign's spread across countries and languages, highlighting a characteristic pattern: seed in one place, echo in another, then repackage as international concern. For the KGB, the ideal influence operation did not look like Soviet influence. It looked like the world spontaneously agreeing with the Soviet Union. And yet, here is the twist that undercuts the fantasy of omnipotent mind control. The KGB's operations did not guarantee results. They competed with reality, with skepticism, with journalists who investigated, and with the simple fact that American society is too large and chaotic to steer easily. Many active measures fizzled. Some were exposed quickly. Some were believed only by fringe audiences. The KGB's own internal culture could be bureaucratic and incentive-driven, rewarding officers for producing activity rather than measurable impact. Even successful disinformation is hard to quantify. Did a rumor change a vote? Did a forged letter alter a policy? Often the answer is unknowable. But influence is not always about immediate conversion. Sometimes it's about changing the weather. If you can make the air feel a little more poisonous, a little more suspicious, a little more exhausted, you create conditions where other events, real events, hit harder. A scandal becomes a crisis. A policy disagreement becomes a betrayal. A tragedy becomes evidence of a conspiracy. In the late Cold War, the United States began to respond more directly. The State Department's public reports on Soviet active measures in 1986 and 1987 were themselves a kind of counter-influence operation. Expose the forgeries, name the patterns, inoculate the public. The logic was almost medical. If disinformation is a virus, transparency is a vaccine imperfect, but better than ignorance. Western intelligence services also ran their own influence and propaganda campaigns. The Cold War was never a contest of innocence versus manipulation. It was a contest of systems, each convinced it was defending itself. The KGB's efforts to shape American minds also intersected with a quieter battlefield: money and political legitimacy. The Soviet Union provided covert support to sympathetic parties and movements abroad for decades. In the United States, the Communist Party USA received Soviet subsidies for years, a fact that became clearer after the Soviet collapse when financial records and archival material surfaced. These funds did not mean the CPUSA controlled America. Its membership and political influence were limited. But the subsidies revealed a consistent Soviet practice: treat ideological sympathy as an asset and invest in it. Still, the deepest irony is that the Soviet Union often misunderstood the society it tried to manipulate. It saw America as a machine controlled by elites, assuming that if you could influence a few institutions, you could control the whole. But America is also a marketplace of competing narratives, and it can absorb, distort, and neutralize external influence in unpredictable ways. Sometimes Soviet efforts backfired, reinforcing anti-Soviet sentiment when exposed. Sometimes they contributed to a broader cynicism that eventually harmed everyone. And then, suddenly, the world changed. In the late 1980s, the Soviet system began to crack. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985 and introduced reforms, glasnost and perestroika, that were meant to save the Soviet Union, but instead loosened the bolts holding it together. The KGB remained powerful, but the ideological certainty that had fueled decades of covert struggle began to erode. Eastern European regimes fell in 1989. The Berlin Wall opened on November 9, 1989, in scenes that looked like history reversing itself. In 1991, after a failed coup attempt in August that involved hardliners including elements connected to the security apparatus, the Soviet Union collapsed. On December 26, 1991, the USSR formally ceased to exist. When the Soviet Union fell, the KGB did not simply vanish into smoke. It was reorganized and splintered into successor agencies in Russia. Archives partially opened, then partially closed. Defectors and former officers spoke. Researchers pieced together patterns from fragments, Michokin's notes smuggled out over years, Gordievsky's accounts, Eastern Bloc records, declassified Western counterintelligence files, State Department reports, investigative journalism. The picture that emerged was not of a magical mind control machine, but of a persistent, well-resourced bureaucracy dedicated to influencing perception as a strategic tool. The aftermath had a strange dual character. On one hand, America won the Cold War in the sense that its rival collapsed, and many people concluded that the age of ideological subversion was over. On the other hand, the techniques refined during the Cold War did not die. They spread, they became cheaper, they became faster, they became available not only to states, but to smaller actors, to private networks, and to anyone who understood how to manipulate information ecosystems. And this is where the story comes back to the present, not as a cheap moral, but as a warning grounded in the past. The KGB's greatest insight was not a Soviet secret. It was a human one. People want stories that explain fear. They want villains. They want coherence. They want to believe they have discovered hidden truth. A disinformation campaign does not succeed because it is clever. It succeeds because it is clever something inside the audience. Its anxieties, its grievances, its desire for certainty. During the Cold War, the KGB tried to control American minds by exploiting America's openness, its conflicts, and its trust in its own information channels. It forged documents because Americans trusted documents. It planted stories because Americans trusted newspapers. It amplified extremes because Americans trusted newspapers. It amplified extremes because extremes are louder than moderation. It used real injustices as megaphones because real injustices are emotionally undeniable. It did not need to invent the cracks. It only needed to widen them. So when you think back to that July morning in 1983, the ink drying on a page in New Delhi, a lie beginning its long migration, remember what made it possible. Not mind control in the science fiction sense, but something more mundane and more enduring. The vulnerability of human attention, the seduction of outrage, and the way a free society's greatest strength, its openness, can be turned against it when people stop asking the simplest, most protective question of all. Who benefits if I believe this?